This Future Cities Africa episode is presented in partnership with OneMap. Visit them at onemap.co.za. Nicolaas Klopper is my guest on Future Cities Africa. He's director at OneMap, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But before we get into that, Nicolaas, welcome. Give us a brief intro to your background and current role.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I'm a chartered accountant. Got roped into the family business just after articles. And yeah, just fell in love with maps and mapping and everything you can do with it.
Who is OneMap and what exactly do you do?
We're an online mapping company. And our main mission is we make the National Property Register easily accessible and help organizations link their data to it in order to produce actionable insights. So we basically just use the map to make complex multidimensional data less abstract and more easy to understand. So typically where we're involved is we're mainly active in the local government space, where we've got a number of municipal financial systems who integrate with us and with whom we integrate to make the financial system visible and visualized on a map, so that you don't just see a list of data, but you actually see a visual display. So typically where we've been involved is some of the municipalities up in Mpumalanga, one specifically larger municipality there, where we help them reconcile their valuation role with their billing system to identify inconsistencies between the market value and the valuation role value, especially the supplementary valuations. And this, we help them identify around 10 million in lost revenue. And it just kind of showcases the value of visualizing the data and bringing it into a common context, really, is what the map does. So it's not just about visualizing it, but it's about bringing it into a common context.
You just mentioned the National Property Register. Can you unpack that?
So the National Property Register, let me start with the property and where properties begin. So in the beginning, you have this massive farm, and then it gets cut up into pieces by land surveyors. So land surveyors would go out, and they would go and survey with their little tripod theodolites and then draw a plan. This plan gets submitted in South Africa, it gets submitted to the Surveyor General, who then approves that plan, and each property on that plan becomes a theoretical property. It gets assigned a unique SG21 key, but that property then is still only a theoretical entity. It only becomes a legal entity once it becomes registered with the Registrar of Deeds. So when I talk about the property register, I talk about every property captured by the Surveyor General in a digital land parcel database that is linked to the title deeds information to indicate the legal status of the property. So basically just a spatial database of all the registered properties in South Africa.
Now we understand what a digital property register is, but why is it relevant to the management of a city?
A city is in essence a really big, complex property management company. Everything in a city, in some way, shape, or form, ties back to the land parcels and managing that effectively. Once a property becomes a legal entity, once it becomes registered, then it becomes liable for property rates and taxes, which obviously then drives municipal revenues, and also becomes eligible for services, which obviously places a responsibility on the municipality and drives revenue at the municipality. So knowing where all your registered properties are that you're responsible for managing, that really is the essence of local government and really is the foundation upon which all other management is built and definitely should be built. So when you've got this city, you're dealing with a really complex entity with like tens of thousands of land parcels and properties and hundreds of thousands of people often. And dealing with such a large volume of data and such a multidimensional array of data Maps just make the data far less abstract, much easier to understand.
You spoke earlier about maps making data less abstract. What do you mean by that?
Obviously, everything we see around us is the real world. And everything that we put into a computer or into a system is in some way an abstraction of that reality. So typically how we abstract it, give an example, would be, so the city would take all its debtors and would list each person in a row and a bunch of columns, and then draw a debtor's age analysis. But that's typically a table that obviously looks nothing like an actual person. A map is also an abstraction of reality in the sense that the real world isn't points, lines, and shapes, but it's just a much more visual and easy to understand abstraction. And it's obviously a shape of a property is much less abstract than just a line in a property description. So seeing the data visually on the map, seeing the spread and areas where poor payment is a problem or areas where service delivery is a problem is much more effective, I find, than looking at a table with 50,000 rows and sorting high to low in Excel. So horses for courses, it works for some people, but making data less abstract is all about visualizing it and bringing it into its real world context. And the map is really a scale model of the real world.
Absolutely, and making the information easier to digest and to understand. But won't a business intelligence tool like Power BI and Tableau do pretty much the same? Make the data less abstract and easy to understand.
What a business intelligence or BI tool typically does, it summarizes and aggregates the data, and some instances segments it as well. And then it distills the data into charts and graphs, typically pie charts or bar charts or whatever. And there's definitely a role for that, but I think that's why we specifically aim for actionable insights. So we once did this project for a consulting company where we actually integrated our maps with their BI dashboards that they did for a city. And the interesting thing was that where the charts and graphs looked fantastic, once we put it on the map, we realized that the underlying data was actually corrupt. Because when you're looking at a chart and a graph, you're only seeing what is actually in your data set. So you're seeing the sample. Whereas if you overlay that data on top of the map is the complete picture. So all of a sudden you start seeing, okay, but here's an entire block where we don't have any ratepayers attached to it. Or here's an entire suburb where no one's reading the meters. Or whatever the case may be. You start seeing the corruption very, very clearly, the corruption in data now. Because you work at such a granular level, because you work on a property per property basis, so it becomes easy to action the issues that you identify. So you can see this property doesn't have a water meter attached to it. So it's not being billed for water. So I can actually resolve that. Whereas if you're looking at a chart and a graph, you only see, well, I've got 400,000 electricity meters, but only 350,000 water meters. And you kind of don't know what to do with that data other than commission an audit. So I like saying maps show gaps.
So in your view, the map is really the one thing that ties everything together.
Geographical information systems and GIS is nothing new in local government. I don't think there's any city in South Africa that doesn't at least have one or two GIS people in the municipality. But what I've found as a non-GIS professional coming into the industry and seeing the potential of this technology to solve real problems and not just be a technical back office function, is that typically what happens is people use GIS as an add-on or something small that they add on to a larger project. So to use a computer analogy, which might be easier to explain, if a city is a complex computer, people currently see the GIS as a small app that they add here and there, or utility that they use for one or two selected tasks. Whereas in my view, and what we're really going for is that the map and the property register should really be the operating system on which everything else is built. So your financial system is actually supposed to be an application built on top of the map, because the map is if you tie your financial system to the map, you immediately have revenue completeness and pretty good assurance about revenue accuracy. If you tie your asset register to the map, then all of a sudden you know exactly where your assets are. When assets are replaced, you're not just going on asset descriptors, but you're actually going on which lamp post's light bulb was changed. And regardless of what the descriptions were, you know that this is accurate, this is the right lamppost that has been replaced because the technician was actually there. Your service apps, your customer service applications, everything should tie back to the property and to a physical location, because that's what a city does. And therefore, the map shouldn't just be an add-on. It's not a nice to have. It really should be the foundation or the operating system that runs a city. And I think one of the things that obviously I came from a completely non-GIS or geography field. One of the first realizations that I had was that, because you go in and you see this technology and you're like, it kind of looks like an ugly Google Maps, because it's columns and tables and a bunch of functions that you don't really understand what's the use. And then you start realizing that this isn't just a picture. This map isn't just a kind of a report. It's an interactive database with just a map pasted on top of it as an interface. So you're really working with complex data at the back, but in an easy to use way. And what it made me think of very early on in my career is, when I was a child, I used to play SimCity, which is a computer game in which you build a virtual city. And thinking back to SimCity, the whole game centers around a map. The main interface is the map that you see, the city that you see, and all the data that you see in the game is all accessed by clicking on the map at various places. And everything is interlinked, because everything is interlinked through the map. And obviously in the game, you don't think of it as a map, you think of it as the actual city. But with the correct software and data processes, and that's really what we're driving, is to get cities to the place to tell them, listen, with the right software and the right processes and the right thinking about maps, you can actually manage your city to a large extent like SimCity, where everything you see is a data point. And it's not just tables and charts and bars and graphs, but it's actually visual.
What is the business case for private sector?
Well, that's massive. And in South Africa, we see it's incredibly underutilized. So I was chatting to one of the large FMCG retailers recently, and they haven't even started implementing geographic information systems or digital maps. They don't even have their customers on a map yet. So the main benefit for private sector is really about knowing where your customers lie and where they are in relation to your stores or especially your competitors' stores, and being able to evaluate your stores and your locations relative to the spatial context and the environmental potential. Once again, it's the same problem that you see in municipalities. You've got distributed management, distributed teams working in isolation and working in silos, but they're all working around something that has a physical context. So typically a store or a customer. So you'll speak to a company and you'll ask them about their marketing databases and they like the living standards measures and demographic indicators. And they're like, okay, but the marketing department has that. They're up in Joburg. And then you're like, okay, but so who decides how you stock a store? No, the ops guys do that. They're down in Durban. And they're like, okay, but yeah, you kind of have to bring those things together to make holistic decisions and to make big picture decisions. And with the information being so disparate and distributed, it kind of makes it hard. So the map really acts as a central node to bring it all together. And then obviously in a world where e-commerce becomes more and more important, last mile delivery is critical. And we see especially now with courier companies and companies doing door-to-door delivery, that there's a lot of potential to add value if you know where your customers are with a great deal of certainty and reliability.
So maps aren't anything new. What is the current state of this mapping environment in South African cities and then also perhaps in other African cities?
There isn't a city in the country that doesn't have GIS to some extent. But what I've realized, my experience with it is that GIS is typically a function in and of itself that operates independently and kind of supports the other functions here and there. The metros, obviously, they generally have good mapping systems, but typically used by the GIS department. I haven't seen a municipality where the finance department actively uses, and if I say use, I don't mean just look at a PDF report, but actually interacts with a map in order to solve their revenue queries and their issues. So GIS, if I can use another analogy, it's very much, if I say GIS, it's mapping. Mapping is very much like what typing was in the 60s and the 70s. Back then, every large company had a typist or a typing pool, and anything that needed to be typed was passed on to the typists. So the finance department, they didn't write their own things. The CFO and the CEO, they didn't actually type anything. They just wrote it down or dictated it and gave it to the typists to then transfer to type. But now I can type, you can type, we all type every day, but we don't think of ourselves as typists. It's just a core competency that we use as a tool to do our real work. And at the moment, I think GIS is seen as a profession and an exclusive domain of GIS technicians, as typing was seen back then as the exclusive domain of typists. But increasingly, I think that we'll see mapping transform into a part of everyone's workflow to an extent. And you'll still get specialists, like you still have people now who are copywriters or who are layout designers. So it's still a specialized application of the mechanical skill of typing, but it's no longer just pure plain typing. The basics everyone can do. So in the African context, see what we've got going for us in South Africa is a fantastic Surveyor General's office or number of offices across the country that actually compiles and maintains the national land parcel database. And then we also have the Register of Deeds. It compiles this and makes it available digitally. So it's possible to create this digital model of cities. When we go out into Africa and speak to other nations, you'll see there's a big drive in Africa at the moment to start implementing property rates and taxes. And the underlying necessity for that, like with our own property rates legislation, part of that legislation, the foundational unit that's liable for property rates is the registered land parcel, or the registered property. Now, you can only have that if you actually have a registered property. And in many cases in Africa, you don't have a formal nationally compiled list of this land parcel on this, between these four boundaries on the earth, this belongs to this person or this entity. So there's a lot of informal land ownership still, and there's a lot of poorly captured data. So we were speaking to guys in Nigeria, and he said it's not, obviously this is not just a story that I've heard from consultants there. So it's not necessarily a blanket statement, but where he said that you'd go out into the field and you'd go survey a piece of land. Because in his estimation, around 30% of the properties there are legally surveyed and has title attached to it. Go out, survey property, go back, go register it, and now you've got your document with the perimeter and the title that you own it. And when you start erecting your perimeter fence, all of a sudden another guy comes, also with a document, also with a legally binding document and title, that says, no, but half of this property is actually his. It intersects his property. But just because it wasn't digitally maintained, there was no way of really knowing that and really picking up on that overlap. And now you have to resolve that after the fact. So mapping in the wider African context is still not something that's as advanced as in South Africa, to the best of my knowledge. But they're definitely getting there, and the need is definitely has been identified.
So for us all to become typists in the sense that you've used, what needs to happen over the next 5 or 10 years?
I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is a mind shift. I often find that when we go into a city and we start speaking to because we typically go to the financial office first, and we'll go to them and say, okay, but let's show you a map. And the first thing that this person does is they kind of switch off, because they're like, okay, no, we'll call the GIS guys. This is not my meeting to be in. And then we say, no, wait. This is not a map for the GIS guys. This is a map for you. This shows you your financial system visualized. This is a way to interpret your data and to do your job better. It's not something that you can delegate or should delegate. Overcoming that mindset, rather, of saying that, oh no, maps are intimidating, maps are scary, and maps are the domain of GIS professionals. That, I think, is the first major challenge that needs to be overcome. The second thing would be in terms of processes and really processes around the data. So getting data linked spatially and getting your processes in place to maintain it, because it's one thing to link the data initially. And this is also a funny story. So we go to this one city, speak to the financial officer. Guy says, no, but they've got a debtor's age analysis map. They don't really need us. And we're like, okay, well, we'd love to see it. So just compare notes. And he calls the GIS guy, who brings him an A0 page, like a massive paper map of 4 years ago. And we're like, yeah, but just having the data once off, that means nothing. It's all about having a system where you maintain the data currency, and it's actually something that you can use. So I think that's the other mindset. Stop thinking about maps as a point in time thing and start thinking about maps as a dynamic and active thing. And finally, I think, especially in the wider African context, and it's not just Africa, it's even a lot of places in the developed world, you find that the property register and these digital maps as a foundation, they haven't been maintained, or they haven't been even captured, and they haven't been valued. And I think an important step is to start moving towards that, where we actually capture that information, where we capture the survey diagrams and the survey documents, and we start digitizing it. And when everyone is going around now, and especially in Africa, the big buzzword is remote sensing, which is where you fly high resolution aerial imagery, or where you fly satellite imagery. And then through AI algorithms, you identify areas. So you'll identify building footprints, and then they use that to manage the citizens. But that's valuable in the extent of giving you a broad overview. But all of these different building footprints, they're only anonymous data points. That building footprint doesn't give someone title, it doesn't give the individual security. It doesn't give them security or secure tenure. It's only a way of seeing, okay, well, there are 10,000 buildings and not 15,000, or 10,000 and not 5,000 buildings. So I think that's also a mindset that needs to change, in not thinking about maps just as a nice to have kind of high level overview, but really seeing the value of it in a granular sense, and being able to use that information to give direct benefit to the people on the ground.
And I think all 3 points that you've mentioned can be overcome or can be improved by upskilling and training. And from the cities that I've been speaking to, it seems that some of those processes are already in place.
The training aspect, and that's the other thing. I think GIS software and mapping software has traditionally been really complex, difficult to use. And if I say difficult to use, it's not more difficult, say, than Excel, if you know how Excel works. But there is a learning curve, and I find definitely myself with the whole concept of apps that are all super intuitive, I've grown kind of lazy to learn new software. And I think generally that's what happens as well. People they don't necessarily want to go through that learning curve. So JS software and mapping software also needs to evolve and become more user-friendly, and the learning curve needs to be flattened out.